So we finished the conversation about all, primary endocrine organs last time, on Tuesday. And today we're going to briefly review the secondary endocrine organs, the ones that have some other main function, but also produce hormones. So the first one would be the heart, which produces a hormone called atrial natriuretic peptide. So the effects of atrial natriuretic peptide are caused by elevated blood pressure. There are two main outcomes of ANP production. First is vasodilation. When receptors in the heart sense the elevated blood pressure, they increase the production of atrial natriuretic peptide, which in turn dilates the blood vessels, which inevitably leads to decreased blood pressure. Another effect of atrial natriuretic peptide is the inhibition of the release of the hormone called renin from kidneys. Renin is the part of the system that I mentioned before, Renin-Angiotensin-Aldosterone System. When renin decreases, angiotensin II decreases, and decreased levels of angiotensin lead to the decreased levels of aldosterone. You probably remember that the main function of aldosterone is to retain sodium. When aldosterone levels go down, instead of retaining sodium, your kidneys start to excrete sodium. This is called natriuresis. You may wonder why natri. Turns out that the Greek word for sodium is natrium. Okay? So far, does that logic make sense to you? So again, ANP decreases renin, renin decreases angiotensin, angiotensin decreases aldosterone. They consequently decrease, one goes down, and as the consequence, another goes down. And when aldosterone goes down, sodium retention goes down, more sodium gets excreted with urine, and what follows sodium? Water, meaning that you start to produce more pee. When you pee more, when you excrete water, the blood volume decreases. Is that understood? And your blood pressure goes down. Makes sense, right? So basically, atrial natriuretic peptide counteracts the effects of aldosterone. We can think of them as antonyms, like the hormones that exert opposite effect on the cardiovascular system. Any questions about this? Okay. Hormones of the stomach. This is just to get you acquainted with those three. I will mention gastrin, histamine, and ghrelin. The gastrin is perhaps the most important hormone produced by your stomach, and it is heavily involved in the regulation of the stomach digestive activities. When the main stimulus for your digestive system is what? Digestive system. What is the main stimulus for your digestive system? Food. It's food. So gastrin responds to any kind of food-related input. It can be taste of the food, or it can be distension of the stomach caused by the food, and that ends up in the stomach. Are we clear? In response to that stimulation, again, it can be taste or smell of the food via vagus nerve, or it can be simply, stomach distension. Stomach cells will produce gastrin, which will act on another subset of cells. I'm not asking the names of those cells, but importantly, that gastrin leads to the release of the hormone called histamine. And histamine, in turn, increases production of hydrochloric acid. So we have gastrin, histamine, hydrochloric acid. What do you think is the function of hydrochloric acid? To break things down, yeah. To digest the food, yeah. Which makes perfect sense. If food is in the stomach, you need more hydrochloric acid to break it down. Does that make sense? Yes.
So Benadryl is an antihistamine, so how is that in relation? How does that work?
Excellent question. Excellent question. In few words, the old antihistamine drugs, like Benadryl, if you overdo them, they would impair stomach digestion and may lead to constipation.
So like if I just take it like one dose,
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. So
does that like affect your stomach when you take it though? But, like,
it would, but not to the noticeable level.
yeah.
One second. Then in the rank of side effects for Benadryl, sleepiness, because histamine participates in the regulation of the wakefulness.
Yeah, I love Benadryl.
Oh, everybody, especially if you're a parent, you should be forever grateful to the creators of Benadryl. Yes.
So could that be used for like indigestion and stuff? Like if your stomach is overactive and you have too much like acid or whatever in your stomach, would like Pepsid and stuff like that beforehand, did that have histamine
Well,
in it?
oh, you mean technically can antihistamines be used?
Yes.
Physiologically, sure, but the thing is, histamine participates in the regulation of so many, especially nervous activities, that you would probably stop indigestion, but you could put yourself in, not in coma, but in pretty deep sleep. So it's just, not worth it, and you can't really direct it. The main advancement in antihistamine development was that the modern antihistamines like Zyrtec, they do not cross blood-brain barrier and do not mess up with the histamine regulation of the wakefulness. Yes.
Well, I was gonna say then how does that have anything to do with like allergic reactions? Kind of like if you are like allergic to something or have allergy issues, you could take it.
Yes. We're gonna talk about this much later, but I will answer this question now. One of the main chemicals that is released during allergic reaction, which is inflammation, is histamine. So when you take antihistamine drugs, you block the release of histamine and you're fine, basically. Did I answer?
Yeah. I just kind of had a light bulb go off when you're like pregnant or you have like really bad migraines. They have like this thing called a headache cocktail.
Okay.
Whenever you go to the ER, it is usually intravenous, like Toradol, and they also give you Benadryl.
Okay.
Like intravenous, and I asked like why they did it, and they said it's a fast acting to make your stomach basically stop
Mm-hmm.
being so mobile.
So, yes.
So that kind of like it all
Makes perfect sense. In the rank of side effects of drugs like Benadryl, sleepiness is the first, and this ranks between the number 3 and number 5. I don't remember number 2. Okay. Is that clear? The sequence gastrin, histamine, HCl. One of really interesting hormones which I find fascinating, ghrelin. Ghrelin is produced when you're hungry. So it basically responds to the empty stomach. When there's no food, ghrelin gets accumulated, and it works on two main levels. One level, it stimulates appetite. Now, you understand that the appetite that you feel, the food cravings, this is purely nervous stimulation. You consciously crave food, and you can consciously overrun those cravings, right? You can say, I'm not going to eat anything now, I will wait till the evening, for instance. You appreciate your cravings, though. Does that make sense? I'm sorry. Another thing that ghrelin stimulates, it stimulates the liver, fat, and pancreas. It stimulates the release of glucose from the liver, breakdown of glycogen, and it stimulates pancreas to produce glucagon, to stimulate lipolysis, glycogenolysis, gluconeogenesis, everything that you need to maintain proper levels of energy supplying molecules when you are hungry. Ghrelin is the hormone of hunger. Does that make sense? We good? Now, intestine produces a whole bunch of hormones which are associated, as you can imagine, with various digestive processes. First two are perhaps the most important for the regulation of digestion per se. Now, we're going to talk about those two hormones when we get to digestive system itself. But you're proficient enough now to quickly, figure out what are the stimuli and what are the effects. So intestine anatomically here, located right after the stomach. Okay, so this is stomach. So it's H. When food comes from the stomach into the small intestine, into the duodenum, it is partially digested. Is that clear? And among other nutrients, it contains fats. So fat is one stimulus for the hormone called cholecystokinin. So cholecystokinin is stimulated by the lipids, the fats, in partially digested food, and it leads to the release of enzymes from the pancreas into the small intestine. Those enzymes will break down that fat. We're clear. So we have fat, CCK, enzymes, and then food breakdown. We good? Now, another thing is, think about the food that comes from the stomach into the intestine. What is the pH in the stomach? Acidic or basic? That's what I'm asking. It's acidic. So that acid will enter the intestine. An intestine by itself is slightly basic. So somehow this acid that comes from the stomach has to be neutralized. Is that clear? So acid will stimulate secretin, which then stimulate the release of bicarbonate, which then neutralize increased pH back to normal. Does that make sense to you? We can basically replace this with a low pH. Are we clear? Are we clear? You can see that for these two hormones, the stimulus again is food. Different aspects of that food, but it's still food. Any questions about this too? We'll work our way through these hormones again today. Now, not only intestine produces hormones that regulate the digestion itself. It also produces hormones that regulate the nutrient metabolism. Among those, two most notable are gastric inhibitory polypeptide and glucagon-like peptide. Gastric inhibitory polypeptide is released when food is digested and nutrients are absorbed in the intestine. This polypeptide acts on the pancreatic B cells, leading to the release of insulin. Now, let's stop here for a second and think about what happens to the levels of the blood glucose after you ate. It goes up. We clear? Now, think about this. Nutrients are in the small intestine, levels of the glucose go up, and this polypeptide immediately signals to the pancreas to start releasing insulin. So those nutrients from the blood, that glucose, amino acids, can be absorbed, can be taken into the cells. Does that make sense? It serves as the sort of early warning system for the pancreas. That makes sense? We're going to get to the second effect a bit later. Basically, the same effect can be found when you look at the actions of GLP, glucagon-like peptide. It stimulates the secretion of insulin and reduced secretion of glucagon from the pancreas. Okay? Also basically increasing the absorption, uptake of the nutrients from the blood into the cells of the body. Does it make sense?
What's the difference between the two?
They're just structurally different. Action-wise, they're very similar. They act on different receptors, and we'll get to possible practical applications from that. Now, I'm sorry. Another interesting effect of both GIP and GLP is that they reduce gastric motility and secretion. Gastric refers to what? Which part of the body? Gastric. Strictly stomach. So what they essentially signal, think about this. Think about the anatomy of digestive system first. I'm going to be very schematic. So this is stomach, and this is intestine. Okay? You following me? So food, partially digested food, moves from the stomach into the intestine. When food enters the intestine, these two hormones, GLP and GIP, are produced. With me? And what they do to the gastric activity? Immediately. They decrease it. Basically, what they, if we would try to make it more anthropomorphic, those hormones tell stomach, wait. We need to deal with the food that's now in the intestine. Let us break it down. Let us get rid of it. And you can send us the next portion. Does that make sense to you? Like, don't slam all the semi-digested food in the intestine. Let us slowly digest it, absorb it, take it into the cells so we're not getting overwhelmed. Does that make sense? Good. Practical applications. Both of these, GLP and GIP, increase insulin levels. And they act on the receptors different from, traditional insulin regulation in the pancreas. So there is a potential for using these peptides as the drugs to treat type 2 diabetes. That make sense? Kidneys. they produce two really important hormones. Now, first one is renin. So here in this scheme you see blood pressure decreases. As blood pressure decreases, kidneys start to produce renin. You may notice that I am skipping some of the steps. You don't need to know them so far. Does that make sense? I'm not asking which cells produce renin. Just know low blood pressure, renin. Renin activates the enzyme and hormone at the same time called angiotensin. There are actually two angiotensins. But all you need to know is angiotensin. Angiotensin stimulates aldosterone. Aldosterone increases sodium and water reabsorption, increases blood volume, increases blood pressure. Does that make sense to you? Yes? Okay, good. That's the steps that I want you to know. Low blood pressure, renin, angiotensin, aldosterone, increased sodium and water retention, blood pressure returns back to normal. We good? Second really important hormone produced by the kidneys is erythropoietin. It responds to hypoxia. And it starts to produce a lot of red blood cells in response to it. Okay. You can technically use this feature as the legal doping. You understand what red blood cells do you? Red blood cells carry oxygen in your blood. So when your tissues experience insufficient amount of oxygen, your kidneys will produce hormone erythropoietin, which then will stimulate more and more red blood cells being produced that will carry oxygen more efficiently. Does that idea make sense? Can you use erythropoietin as the performance enhancement drug in the endurance sports? I'm not asking can you. That's the beauty of English language. Can you? Yeah, sure, why not? Are you allowed? Is it legal? No. So erythropoietin is not a legal performance enhancement drug. But what professional athletes do, they either travel to Colorado, Utah, or any other mountainous area where oxygen content in the air is lower, so they put themselves in the artificial hypoxia state, or much simpler, there are devices, basically you can wear a mask, that will limit the amount of oxygen that you can inhale, putting you essentially in the hypoxic state. And if you exercise in this state, you're going to be miserable as hell for several days, and then your blood will have way more red blood cells, and eventually you will train well, and then when you do the race on the plains, you take the mask off, and now you're awesome. Because you used to perform in artificial hypoxia, now you don't have it, and you're just incredible. Yes?
Do you know if like certain ethnic groups who are from mountainous regions
Probably.
to make more red blood cells?
Probably so, yes. Yeah, I think I read about the statistics. People who live in the mountains, you can move to the mountains,
Yeah.
and you're going to make more red blood cells. Yes.
So how do athletes like the Denver Nuggets, they live in Colorado, right? So now that
It's not high enough.
it's not high, okay.
You have to think really high. Have you ever been to like 10,000 feet, maybe 8,000 feet? I had a privilege to do it once. It was awful. I ran 2 miles and I thought I'm gonna die. But then I went back to Louisiana and I was flying. For several days, I was like a champion. And then it all came back. So basically what a lot of professional endurance athletes do, they live there. They live in Colorado or Utah or mountainous regions of California. And then when there's a race, usually those races are in, at the sea level, sort of. They supposed to have an advantage. Bless you.
A lot of military people who wear like the, I don't know, they look like Bane, like the masks, and they will run so they can get their 2 miles at a good speed so they can pass their PT test.
Yeah, absolutely. You can do it. Yeah, that's the same idea. Without traveling to Colorado, the air that you inhale contains less oxygen. Make sense? Or it controls the amount of air that you can inhale. So basically, partially suffocating yourself. Now, bones produce hormone called osteocalcin. We don't really know what triggers it. We know it probably something with energy balance. Okay, we know that osteocalcin stimulates insulin release, but what's the importance? It's kind of not really known. So stimulus, unknown. Now this one is very well known. That's called cholecalciferol or vitamin D. Vitamin D is produced by your skin when you are exposed to the UV light. And it is chemically modified in the liver, reaches the kidneys, and in kidneys, vitamin D is activated by parathyroid hormone. And then this activated form of vitamin D stimulates the absorption of calcium in the intestines. Does that make sense? So, if you think about the real life implications, you know how you have to make sure that your child, when he or she grows, has sufficient amount of calcium in the diet. Correct? And supposedly they should absorb that calcium from products in the intestine. The problem is, if they don't have a lot of vitamin D, that absorption in the intestines will be fairly poor. Am I clear? And it all depends on the amount of sunlight that you receive over the year. So, in the countries or regions where amount of sunlight is fairly low, it can become a problem. And I show this picture in AP1, and I can try to find it here. It's just pretty cool picture. I don't remember what was the search query, but I will try. Let's see if I can find. Yeah, that's a pretty awesome picture. That's the reality. I really like the portrait of Vladimir Lenin on the wall, but it was a reality. I'm not sure if I think I was exposed to this when I was really, really small. I think in preschool they did this, but I just don't remember. Maybe when I was 4. So that's a reality. Kids were exposed to UV light, wearing this absolutely incredible protective shades. And because, if you live in the northern parts, your winter starts in October and it's done in April, and it's not much sunlight over that time. Okay? So you have to be exposed to the UV light in one way or another to ensure that you have a proper calcium absorption. That makes sense? So stimulus here for production will be sunlight, but the effect eventually is going to be absorption of calcium in the intestine, and activation is necessary. Liver. I picked 3 hormones, which we will run into. One is somatomedin. This is a familiar one. This is a different name for insulin-like growth factors. Remember those? Insulin-like growth factors that stimulate, well, growth. Okay, and they also work as the negative feedback molecules for the growth hormone regulation. Another hormone that you already heard about today, angiotensinogen, is a precursor for angiotensin-1. So essentially, renin acts on the angiotensin-1, converting it. Sorry, let me start over. Renin acts on the angiotensinogen, converting it into the angiotensin-1. Question, Jenna?
Sorry, I don't have my contacts, so I can't see the board today, so I was asking for
I can try to make it bigger.
thanks.
As a person who's short-sighted, I understand the struggle. Okay, so angiotensinogen is converted to angiotensin by renin. And then angiotensin, as you may remember, stimulate the release of aldosterone. Does that make sense so far? Now, the third hormone that I want you to know is thrombopoietin. By analogy with erythropoietin, thrombopoietin stimulates formation of platelets. And the regulatory mechanism is absolutely awesome. Normally, thrombopoietin produced by liver is bound to platelets. Now, imagine this for a second. Imagine this. You have a bunch of thrombopoietin. It's green here. And it's all bound to platelets. That makes sense? So, if all thrombopoietin in the blood is bound to platelets, do you have any free thrombopoietin floating around? No. No, right? Now, think about this. For some reason, platelets, their numbers go down. Thrombopoietin doesn't have cells to bind to now. No. So you have more and more free thrombopoietin in the blood. Does that make sense? This free thrombopoietin stimulates your bone marrow to produce more platelets. When platelet counts go back to normal, all free thrombopoietin binds to platelets. There is no more free thrombopoietin in the blood. No more platelets are produced. Yes?
So what if you have a platelet-like problem? Like if you do not
Have platelets?
So do you just have those floating around everywhere?
Thrombopoietin molecules? Yeah.
So does that in return jack everything up?
Not really. It's very specific, but it depends on what kind of platelet problem you have. If, for instance, your bone marrow fails to respond to thrombopoietin, then you may have astronomical levels, no platelets, right? Same, slightly different causative relationships. If your bone marrow fails to produce, so say your megakaryocytes just do not produce platelets. In this case, what can happen? Thrombopoietin will stimulate your bone marrow. Your bone marrow will produce cells called megakaryocytes. But the last step, megakaryocytes, they produce platelets. If they don't do it, you're going to have a whole bunch of megakaryocytes that are useless, basically. They will float around. They will probably get into the spleen, lead to splenomegaly, but you're still going to have no platelets. But all in all, no platelets, a lot of free thrombopoietin. Does that make sense?
But that won't
It depends on the why you don't have platelets. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because if your bone marrow doesn't even start, then no. If your bone marrow starts to make platelets and stops in the middle, you're gonna have a bunch of these half-ass platelets, sort of. You know what I'm talking about? These cells that are not platelets yet, they're dysfunctional, they're not needed. Your probably spleen will try to get rid of it, so it will become larger. So that may lead to splenomegaly. Make sense? Which brings us to my favorite hormones. These are leptin and adiponectin. You know what? I'm going to talk about adiponectin first. Adiponectin is kind of an unusual hormone. It is mostly produced by adipose tissue. I believe it was shown recently that muscles can produce adiponectin, but I'm not sure. Adipose tissue is our safe bet. So what is so unusual about this hormone? Well, first, hormones usually work in incredibly small concentrations. So if you test somebody's blood for the levels of thyroid hormone or growth hormone, the concentrations are going to be low. It's just normal. Adiponectin reaches astronomical levels. He's like 1,000, 10,000 times more adiponectin than any other hormone. Why? We have no idea. Now, what is the stimulus? We're not really sure. We definitely know what downregulates adiponectin, what decreases the levels. Obesity and type 2 diabetes. Now, let me ask you this. Generally speaking, obesity is a lifestyle disease, or you're basically doomed to be obese? Lifestyle, right? So basically, it's kind of your acquired disease. Type 2 diabetes, mostly lifestyle as well. Does that make sense? So it turns out that in conditions that are inflammatory, those are inflammatory conditions, and acquired, adiponectin is decreased. And it was very convincingly demonstrated that in the mouse models, that if you take mice that have type 2 diabetes, for instance, and you give them adiponectin, the insulin sensitivity increases. So their type 2 diabetes kind of starts to subside. You give adiponectin to mice with atherosclerosis, and that reduces the number of atherosclerotic plaques. You give adiponectin to mice with obesity, and that helps them to lose weight. Adiponectin regulates energy balance. I don't see if we have any energy balance in the picture. But yeah, glucose uptake, fatty acids. So energy balance, it, optimizes it basically. Sounds awesome, doesn't it? You take adiponectin and you're healthy. Well, it turns out that in people with chronic autoimmune inflammatory diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, levels of adiponectin are extremely high. Why that is so, we don't know. One of the hypotheses, which sounds to me personally fairly convincing, is that adiponectin can be stimulated by inflammation. Does that make sense to you? Adiponectin release is organism's response to inflammatory condition. And if you have something like obesity, elevated levels of adiponectin should bring it down. Does that make sense? Now, if you have an inflammatory condition like rheumatoid arthritis, it's chronic. So your cells, whatever, they try to quench that inflammatory response, but they can't. So you constantly have elevated levels of adiponectin that have no effect on rheumatoid arthritis. Basically, it's more of a consequence of inflammatory disease rather than the reason. Okay, So it's mainly responsible for energy balance, and it's also anti-inflammatory and cardioprotective. But my favorite hormone is leptin. Leptin is produced by the adipose tissue in response to the food, to eating. When you eat, leptin levels start to rise and they act on hypothalamus, decreasing your appetite. You feel full. I can tell you why it's my favorite hormone. Think about this. If you start producing thyroid hormone, can you consciously overcome its effects? Can you tell your body, stop increasing my basal metabolic rate? You can't. With leptin, you can counteract at least one effect. You understand that you're full, but you just keep on eating because it tastes oh so good. Does that make sense? And it actually leads to a very interesting condition that is called leptin resistance. When the person constantly overeats, leptin levels are constantly elevated. And eventually, receptors for the leptin become resistant to these high levels. And it's kind of paradoxical that in people who are obese, you can test them for the levels of leptin even without eating anything, and they're still going to be higher, much higher than people who have a normal body weight because of the leptin resistance. Does that make sense? I showed it. I had mice that were pretty obese, and they had very high levels of leptin compared to the normal weight counterparts. Now, leptin is basically the opposite of ghrelin. Ghrelin stimulates your appetite. Leptin inhibits it. But there is a condition, genetic condition, that is associated with a leptin deficiency. If you cause this condition in mice, this is what you're going to get. On the right, it's the normal mouse. Okay? Well, it's not completely normal, but we'll get to it. This is how a normal mouse should look like. On the left, a mouse that does not produce leptin. The average size of the lab mouse is about 25-28 grams. These monsters start from 60. It's actually really sad looking at them. They have troubles moving around the cell, the cage. They huge, like enormous. It's easier to jump over them than to walk around, basically, like little blobs, okay? Now, the mouse on the right is the same type of mouse as on the left, but after 3 weeks of leptin injections. See how much weight it lost? And this image, this kid had a leptin deficiency, genetic deficiency for leptin. I don't remember the age, but I think on the left, it's the image of that kid at the age of 4. Okay, he's enormous. And he started to receive regular leptin injections. And by the age of 6, he was the, age-appropriate size, let's put it this way. Does that make sense? I think that's pretty cool. That's why I like leptin. Okay. Any questions? Well, good?